Okay.
Okay, so let me share my screen. All right. Can you all see this? It is loading. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about assessments and rubrics in your multi-level classroom, which is something that I've worked a lot with. So out of you, do both of you have a multi-level classroom?
Yes.
I'm going to guess.
Everybody has a multi-level classroom.
Some people do get a little lucky, maybe if they're working at a Hagwon or another situation where it can get equaled out some, but most of you do, I'm sure.
Yeah,
Almost
sure.
everyone.
Yeah.
And so I want to talk a little bit about why your students have different levels. What are some things that you've identified with that?
Well, they've had different exposure to English. They've had different education outside of school. Some of them have gone to Hagwon. Some of them have had other experiences like living abroad. Some of them just like Marvel movies or something like that. So you'll have students whose English knowledge and experience just doesn't match up. And they may have various strengths and weaknesses. Actually, it's hard to just say one student is higher. They might just have different English experience.
Yeah, definitely. Nicholas, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I suppose it's kind of a motivational thing as well for them. You know, some students just simply don't see the value in English, or they've been told the value by somebody else, but they don't have any like intrinsic motivation.
Right.
You know?
And their level will differ from day to day too.
Yeah, and some just find it more difficult. I think, just physically to form the words and to understand. It's just some people. I think some people are better at languages than others.
Yeah. So in general, there's just tons and tons of factors that make our students have different strengths, weaknesses, have different levels, so to speak. So today we're going to talk a little bit maybe about how to level out that playing field and what we can do to help them all succeed. So when it comes to differentiation, right now on the screen I have why or why not, but I want to know, do you differentiate your assessments for your different levels of students?
Yes. Yeah. So we did our midterm tests like last week and the week before. I've got I teach two different kind of levels at the moment. So yeah, it's just a case, for example, in that situation of making the tests. I don't know. I mean, more easier for one class than the other. I mean, just taking into account like how many questions to put in there, level of difficulty of the questions, how long they are in terms of how long it's going to take them to read and decipher the questions and things like that. So yeah, basically.
Okay. Well, working in the Korean context, at the university level, we have mandatory grading curves, right? And we need to be able to decide who's going to get the A's and who's going to get the B's and who's going to get the C's. And we want to make it so that it's not impossible for students who have had less exposure to English to succeed in the course. So I guess I try to make different paths to success. And some of those, well, the criteria would be different in different cases. I mean, some things are just graded on completion. But then at some point you have to grade performance too. And it's really hard to differentiate that within a class. Sometimes I've had to. I mean, I've had students who were from North Korea who just didn't have the same background as the other students. And in order to enable them to complete the class, I had to create a completely different assessment for them. But
Mhm.
if I were to do that in general, I think students would complain. I mean, I'd have to have a very good reason for doing it.
So we'll talk about some solutions I found to that in a bit. I used to work last year in a university way down in Jinju, which is where I started differentiating a lot, because in Jinju, which is pretty countryside, I had students who barely knew the alphabet and then students who were pretty fluent. So if I had just assessed them the same, a lot of students would have failed straight off. And I didn't want to do that. Actually, I don't want to fail anyone. I had a whole argument against the grading curve. So let's talk a little bit about equality versus equity. I know that this picture is super cheesy and that you've seen it a million times. But when it comes to our classrooms, our students all need different things to be able to succeed, right? Some students, like this super tall guy here, don't really need anything in terms of scaffolding, in terms of how they get assessed. They can do it. They don't need any help. Whereas we have some other students who probably need a whole lot of our help. And so if we don't give the lower level students the help that they need, they're not going to be able to succeed. They're probably not going to have a lot of motivation. And for our lower level students, they have probably sat in English class for years. They've probably gotten a lot of bad or poor grades, and they feel bad about this. So they're going to be demoralized even before they get into our classes, I think. And higher level students, if they come into a class where they think they already know everything, are going to feel really bored. Have you had experiences with students like this?
Yeah. It's a bit more difficult to tell at the moment because all our stuff's online. So it's like it's like you can't when you actually face to face with the students in the room, you can really get that. Like you pick up the body language, pick up this person's bored, this person's not paying attention because they know it already, this person's struggling, whatever. It's a bit harder online. Yeah.
It definitely is harder online, I think. And so both of you are at universities. Are both of you teaching freshman English?
Yeah.
I have a mix. I have English majors.
Oh, you have some English majors? Oh, that's always great.
Freshman English, yes.
Yeah, so online does present a different challenge. When I would get assignments from my students when I was working in university, some of them you can tell are just completing it to complete it. So I lived in Jinju. So if they would write about Jinju, I would come across the word pearl a lot because they were just putting it through an automatic translator and not even checking. So I could tell very quickly that those students had just checked out. So I would send them messages and tell them not to just put stuff through a translator, to please try some, and that I would give them points for trying, which a lot of students do like that, I find. If you just tell them to try and that they'll get points for trying, even if they fail, they might still try. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about identifying English levels, choosing appropriate assessments, differentiating that assessment, and we'll talk about rubrics some. So Heidi and Nicholas, where are you two from?
Well, I'm American originally, but I came to Korea 20 years ago.
A while ago. Nicholas, how about you?
I'm from the UK.
The UK? Okay. So when we're talking about identifying students' English levels, I'm going to talk a bit about a method that we use in the United States for K through 12, but you can still apply it pretty well to Korean students and UK students because it's just a system. So for assessing students' English levels, I really like to use WIDA, which is World Class Instructional Design and Assessment. This is what schools in the United States use K through 12 to classify English learners. And so with WIDA, it's divided into 6 levels, but level 6, you don't have to worry about because that's completely fluent. They don't count as an English learner anymore at that point. So level 1 at the lowest phase is a student who doesn't speak English at all. Maybe they can say hello, goodbye, I'm fine, thank you, and you. And that's kind of it. Level 2, they can speak a little bit, chunks of language a bit, but really still very poor. Most of your students will probably, hopefully, fall between levels 3 and 4, which is an intermediate ability to speak. So they can speak with a lot of difficulty. They can read and write some. They are acquiring more skills. They can achieve things. Level 5 is a pretty advanced speaker. Even if you work with a lot of Koreans who speak English pretty well, but they still need to maybe Google Translate some things, are level 5. The reason that I like to work with WIDA is that they post a lot online. So if you need example assessments, if you need sample rubrics, if you just need to download something, if you need resources, WIDA already has it done. So I would recommend it if you're interested getting knee deep into classifying students, but I do understand this might be a little complicated if you're not that familiar with it. Heidi, have you used WIDA before?
No, I've used the Common European Reference, CEFR, you know, but it looks very similar. Nicholas, maybe you've used the same thing coming from Europe. It also has 6 levels, so I guess level 1 and 2 here would be similar to A1, A2. Most Korean college freshmen at my school are late A2, beginning B1. The English majors generally B2. So that would be maybe level 4, level 5-ish on this thing. I find those levels are really broad. They're huge. So like even within a level, you have many sub-levels.
So what I like about WIDA, like I said, they post a lot of rubrics online, but they'll post a lot of different rubrics. They have whole books for different subjects and for different categories. So speaking, reading, writing, listening. So if a student is a level 4 in one category and a level 3 in the other, you can just get the different rubrics. And I think for CEFR, they probably also publish a lot of rubrics, but I've not looked into it yet much. Anyway, so this is the way I generally classify my students, but a much easier way to do it is have easy, medium, and advanced assessments, which could be, think of low level, intermediate, and high level students. Within these 3 categories, when I say intermediate or when I say medium level, that doesn't necessarily always mean levels 3 and 4 here, or B1 and B2. It generally means whatever the largest chunk of your class is in. So if you think about 70% of my students are this, you can think of level 3 or level B1, if you will, as the medium in your class. And then from there, you can have your easy assignments and your advanced assignments. Because if most of your class is way down here, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to bother with intermediate level or advanced level. So, and again, you can of course think about what's appropriate for your classroom, how many different levels are appropriate for your classroom, how to divide people up. I'm sure that you know your students a lot better than I could because I'm a stranger to them. So, all right. So this is a writing assignment that I designed for 3 different levels. We can look at it and then talk about it for a bit. So the assignment was about descriptions. They had this picture of a woman and the students needed to describe her. So for my low level students, I designed this. It's a closed activity. They just have mostly adjectives and a couple of nouns in here. You can see within the sentences, they're pretty short. There's no really big words. It's all very simple. So even students who are that level 1, level 2, or A1, A2 can probably attempt this. Even if they have almost no English, they'll probably try. If they look, the person in this picture is a woman, they can at least get one answer. Whereas if we gave them something else, they might not even try to write anything. So in my book, that's already a bit of a win. For the intermediate level students, I want them to try to write a sentence probably. I want them to be able to read this. I want them to comprehend it, and I want them to write something. Of course, when we write sentences, the language that we want the students to write in is reflected, right? How old is the person in the picture? The person in the picture is, so they have a bit of a scaffold there. They have all of the vocabulary words that they need. Mostly, they don't need to come up with too much. And for my advanced students, I'm not going to tell them much at all besides to describe them and to give me descriptive adjectives. So my advanced students, I'm not providing any scaffolding. I want them to know what descriptive adjectives are, to be able to use them a lot. And because they're advanced students, I don't give them a lot of framework. This, I think, can be really beneficial because it allows the advanced students to be more creative in their writing. So if we tell them write a paragraph, write 2 paragraphs, they might kind of, whatever. But this is pretty broad. It's pretty vague. So in the past, I've gotten answers. I've gotten a story about her. She looks like she has sad eyes. So maybe she's waiting in a coffee shop. She's waiting for her partner who didn't show up. I've gotten poems before. I've gotten students who are really experimenting with their English. A lot of the times, if we structure things too hard, that can really narrow things down. So for advanced students, if we leave it broad, we can give them the chance to experiment with more things. So, do you have any thoughts or questions about these assessments so far?
Yeah, I was wondering, who are the students that you would use this with? Like, is this for university students or what level?
I use this with the university students, but I would also, I think this would be fine for high school students and maybe even middle school students, depending on what kind of school you're at.
These students are all in the same class. Is that right?
Yes.
So then how did they react to, like, were they aware that you were assessing them all differently?
Yes. So the way I would do this is that in my online classroom, I would give them the 3 options, easy, medium, difficult. And I would say, just choose one and turn it in. And students, pretty much, they know what level they are. And students generally want to work within their level. So if a low level student clicks the easy one, like I said, they're probably going to try. If an advanced student clicks this, they might try it. Of course, you might get students who want to work outside of their level. Maybe you'll get an advanced student who comes into class and they're tired and their dog died and they're sick and they're having a terrible day. And they don't want to do this, but they look at this. They see that this option is there. And they'll think, okay, you know what? I feel terrible, but I can do that. So at least they're coming to class to do something. So yesterday, I listened to one of the lectures about motivation within a classroom by George. It started with a K. Yeah, it was really good. And he was talking about, to be motivated, you need to feel like you're accomplishing something. You need to feel like there's a purpose to what you're doing. So if we were to give an advanced students this, they would feel like there's no point in that. That's way too easy. I'm learning nothing. So I think there really are a few benefits in doing this. And because I gave them the option of what to do, there wasn't a lot of pushback about like, this is unfair. Why are they getting assessed differently than me? Because they have the option there. They're the ones who chose it.
How do you, I don't know. It's like, it does make sense to me, but I'm thinking about the grading side of things and how do you go ahead, grade it? So I don't know how to explain it, but they're all different levels. They're in the same class. So you're supposed to grade them against each other, or
so
how do you conceptualize it? Because I'm kind of old school. I'm thinking like you're in the same class.
So
you're good and you're not good, so you're going to get a good grade and you're not. Simple as that. But how do you do
this
that?
is where our rubrics can come in. So if we also have differentiated rubrics, we can use those rubrics to grade for the level, which we'll talk about soon. But actually for this, if it's a homework assignment or a class assignment, I would just do it binary or a 1 point rubric, a single point rubric, where did they complete it? Did they not complete it? If they completed it, they can get 100 and they can get notes back from me about how they did. And if they didn't complete it, then it's a 0. However, we'll get to the rubrics and how to differentiate that in a bit, I hope. Any other questions for here?
For me.
No? Okay. So as I said, you can either divide your students up or let them self-select what they want to do. So self-selecting is really motivating and empowering because, like I said, students will probably at least try, and they might try a bit more than if you're just to say you're intermediate. Also, I really like having these levels and letting students self-select because it offers a chance for students to move up in a tangible way. So if I get really low level students or students who think they're low level, but they've been doing great on these assignments, I can say, okay, Sumin, for the last 5 assignments, you've been doing great. You've gotten them all right. You know, you've only had a couple of errors. And Sumin can feel really good about herself. She'll think, oh, the teacher thinks I'm doing a good job. You know, she wants me to try more. So she might try to push herself. So, like I said, you can motivate students by showing them that they can succeed. Whereas if we just had this level here, you might have students who can't. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about assessment strategies. So within our classrooms, we have tons of different assessment strategies that we use. I'm sure now that we're online, you probably don't have a lot of anecdotes about your students because it can be hard to get one-on-one time or see them as they're working. You know, we have performance assessments, like, of course, performances, tests, videos, whatever. Portfolios. Does anybody use a portfolio within their classroom?
I don't. it's not really like a formal portfolio,
Mm,
but they have to upload their work
mhm.
to a place where we can all see it. So that
Mm.
in that sense, there's a kind of record of what
kind
they've
of-
done. Yeah.
Mm. And James says, haven't for a while. Yeah, I love portfolios, but they are really hard to keep a track of. But then if you do make it to the end of the year and you can point out to a student, look how far you've come, it can be really empowering. A Salome matrix, if you're familiar, student oral language observation matrix. I really like them. So let's talk a little bit. What assessments do you use in your classroom currently, mostly?
I'm not sure if there's a word for it, but we're doing a presentation. I'm teaching a presentation course at the moment, so
Mhm.
it's, I guess, using rubrics. Students have to record their presentation,
Mhm.
and we use rubrics to assess their presentation,
Mhm.
give them feedback based on that, really.
Mhm.
That's really it. There's, there's like, yeah, that's the main thing, I think.
So a lot of presentations. Great.
Yeah.
My example involves presentations.
It's good.
Right. How about you, James? What do you use?
Mainly presentations. The students it's very small classes and there's enough time to be able to get through them. And then also personal interviews, scheduling interviews, and then having them just answer the questions and go through and, have some rote answers, but then also some curveballs depending on their strength, and just trying to keep them on task, not only with the memorized answers, but also some put a few things in there, because to get to the second or third week, a lot of the students have settled into their strengths and weaknesses, and there's hopefully a surprise student here or there, but for the most part they kind of just cruise along. The better students get to the best students, and the okay students just kind of, all right, I found out where I'm at in this ranking system and I'm gonna go with it. And there's just not enough at my students, the community that I have here at this particular university, there's not much a competition level driving them to try and get somewhere. And so, yeah, they continue doing what they do.
Yeah, the ranking can sometimes really destroy student motivation. So it can be really difficult to work through, which is why differentiation can be useful if you can implement it. And Heidi, what about you? What are your go-to assessment forms?
Okay, well, presentations, essays with rubrics. I do a lot of small, low stakes quizzes, like often just on the previous week, the feedback that I gave them on the previous week comes up in a quiz. And if people do poorly on one quiz, then I'll tell them that's going to come up again in a future quiz. So I try to keep a cycle going with those.
Oh, that's really interesting. That's a great idea, actually, to maybe motivate them to pay some attention to and to be active in the classroom. So when we have these assessments, before we create the assessment, we generally write objectives, or we have objectives, because we want our students to accomplish something in our class. But generally, what we want this something to be should vary depending on students' level and ability. So for low-level students, if they can come to class and I can say, how are you? And they can say, I'm fine. I'm ecstatic sometimes because they said a word in English. However, for my advanced level students, I am not satisfied with that. That's not a good objective for them. For my high level students, I want them to have accomplished much more. They have the ability to, so generally they should. So let's talk a bit about writing objectives with our assessments. So when it comes to objectives, we generally have content objectives and language objectives. Do any of you use content within your classroom?
You mean like content-based learning?
Content-based learning, CLIL, do you use just straight English textbooks or do you incorporate other things in?
It depends on
Mostly
the class. With my
Mostly.
English, yeah, with my English majors, I let them bring in a lot of authentic materials, and they do a lot of choosing their own material to study.
We'll go over content a bit because content language or content objectives and language objectives are pretty interconnected. And then that way, if you do want to use content in your class, then it's covered. So even when we're just teaching English, we generally incorporate content of some sort. If you're talking about, cooking, or you want to talk about science or current events, that can be a lot of content. I like using content because I think it's easier if I can just find something that I think will interest my students, because I've read a lot of English textbooks. I've read my own Korean textbook. Generally, they're not that fascinating. I don't want to sit up late at night and read it like I might want to read a novel. So by incorporating content, we can motivate or interest our students. And when we're writing our objectives, we want to think about our assessments again. So let's look at some objectives. So for content, this is a lesson about earthquakes. It was for, I think, elementary level, but you can just think of this in terms of your students. Think of these as very vague things. So for this lesson about earthquakes that I made for elementary level, I want students to discuss about earthquakes, talk about how they are, how they can be measured. I want them to analyze ideas and talk about how they're related to natural disasters. I want them to know appropriate vocabulary about earthquakes and be able to apply them. And then finally, I want them to be able to create a video. And so if we want to get rid of all the content, let's look at language objectives. So we can see within my content, I already have discussing, I have them talking and hypothesizing. I want them to know vocabulary, and I want them to make a video. So when I'm writing my objectives, my language objectives, I can write them a bit similarly to this. I can take my content objectives, and for my low-level students, my beginner students, I want them to be able to define vocabulary with visual aids like pictures and scaffolded sentences, maybe just matching. And I want them to create a video with a lot of scaffolding. And for my advanced students, I don't have intermediate here just because there wasn't space on the slide. I want them to be able to orally define vocabulary terms and use them correctly. I want them to discuss what they've learned. I want them to ask questions. I want them to know, to show that they know the language surrounding the curriculum. And I want them to orally summarize what they've learned in a video. So I'm not giving them a lot of scaffolding here. Okay, so if you don't use content again, you can scribble all of this out over here and just look at my language objectives. If you get rid of earthquakes, the word earthquakes here, you could substitute that in for whatever you're doing. Okay. All right, do you have any questions about these objectives? Okay. So now let's talk about differentiating our assessments or assignments with this. So I had my objectives. Now let's look at the assessment that I made. So the assessment is to create a video. I want to have students speaking. So for my really low-level students, I can give them a paper that looks like this. And there's a picture. For my low-level students, I want them to say, it's earthquake, this earthquake, earthquake. I just want them to know a vocabulary term. And if they can give me something resembling a sentence, all the better. And I'm giving them some scaffolded sentences. Earthquakes happen when plate move. Earthquakes happen when big wave. Just chunks of language. I want them to give me something that's related to the lesson. For my intermediate students, I'm giving them a bit more. I'm still giving them full sentences here. So what are earthquakes? Earthquakes are, I want them to know how to form that sentence, right? What causes them? You can see I replaced earthquakes with them. What can you do? So there's only 3 questions here, right? It's the same 3 questions that are here, technically, but they're in a more difficult format. You can also see visually, these look pretty different already. For my low-level students, they have a big picture, they have lots of white space, they only have a few words. If we give low-level students a piece of paper and it's a wall of text, they're going to shut down, they're going to panic. I know if somebody gives me a piece of paper that's all in Korean, my first instinct is going to be to pull out my phone and Google Translate it instead of trying to read it. But if I see some Korean text and it's a lot of white space, there's pictures, I'll probably at least try to read it. And for my advanced level students, I have written them a mini essay. Earthquakes can be a devastating natural event that has an impact on both the environment and people. So we can see, even in terms of language that I use, this prompt is pretty different. Students need to know words like devastating, impact, environment, which can be quite advanced vocabulary terms. They also need to be able to read all of this. They need to be able to know what to do. I'm telling them to use all 10 vocabulary words. So they need to know these words and they need to be able to incorporate them in a natural manner. So there is quite a big jump between the intermediate and the advanced. But like I said, most of our students will probably be comfortable swimming around this area. Okay, any thoughts or questions about this?
What is a PSA?
A public service announcement. So when you hear about what to do in case of a fire.
Oh, that's the video that they make.
Yeah. So they'll be making a little video about earthquakes.
So the video prompts, this is for them to understand what to do in the production stage of the lesson. Is that right?
Yes. So I'm going to be grading my students differently. And because I want them to do different things, this is what I want them to be able to say in the video. So for this particular assignment, I might divide my students. But again, I'm thinking if I let my students self-select, they're going to probably select what's appropriate.
Do the low-level students also make public service announcements?
Yeah, low-level students can still definitely speak. So the benefit of doing a video is that a student can make a bit of a script for themselves, right? We're not asking them to speak organically. So the low-level student can use visuals, like I mentioned in my objectives, if I go all the way back. So they can use visual aids, they can use some scaffolded sentences, and I'll have some accommodations for them when it comes to that. So
do you
my
show
low,
sorry.
oh, go
Sorry.
ahead and ask.
I was going to say, do you show them any, model PSAs in the process?
Yes. So I would show them model PSAs. For low-level students, I would probably show them a PSA first in Korean so that they know what it is. They know what it is they're trying to accomplish. I would probably show or make a really easy English PSA. If possible, I would try to find one with subtitles. And because modeling is going to give our students a lot of help just to know what they should do.
Okay.
Mhm.
So this is kind of basically a reading activity. Am I right?
So this is reading, and they should write some from this. They should try to write their script, what they're going to use from these prompts.
Okay.
Okay, is it clear?
Sure.
Okay. So as we see, all of these levels of students will make a video. And so when it comes to differentiation, generally students can and should complete the same assessment as long as it's been adjusted for their level. If we start making different assessments, we say you make a video, but you do a worksheet, you do this. First of all, it will be messy for you trying to grade. And that's where you might get students say that's not fair. Making a video takes way more time than it takes to write a worksheet. And also the expectations for our students can still be pretty high. All low-level students need is scaffolding to be able to achieve things. And high-level students can generally work a lot more independently. Okay. All right. Any final questions? Because we're about to get more workshop-y. Okay. Okay.
All right, there's something that I had a question about earlier, and I wonder if you could explain it, what it was a bit more. You talked about Solemn. I think
Yes.
it's Student Oral Language Observation Matrix. Did you say?
Yes.
I've never heard of that before, so I was wondering if you
Oh.
could say anything about that.
Yeah, sure. So a Salome matrix, I really love a good Salome matrix because a Salome matrix is something that you can keep in your classroom and you can mark up like just as you're talking to a student organically. Hold on, let me find an example and I'll explain it really quick. So let me download this PDF and let me see if I can rotate it. Okay. All right, so can you see this? So a Salome matrix is based off of 5 different criteria, right? We have comprehension, fluency, vocabulary, pronunciation, and grammar. And it goes from 1 to 5. So as you're speaking to a student, you can just mark their levels within the different categories. So maybe you have a student who understands you really well. So they're a level 4 in comprehension, but they can't speak hardly any. They're really hesitant, so they get a level 2 here. They know words okay, but oh my God, their pronunciation is really bad. So generally, as a student is speaking, as you're assessing a video or a performance, you can mark this pretty organically and you can keep it and see how they improve over time. And it's pretty flexible and fluid. So if you're interested in Salome, you can just put it into Google and you can download these charts. I think they're really great, but of course it's whatever you want to do in your own classroom. Okay. And I can send this in the chat, I think. Any other questions now? All right, there's your Salome matrix. You're welcome. Okay. So what we're going to do now will be a little bit more workshopy. I'm going to send you a lesson plan. I want you to choose an assessment, and I want you to try to adjust the objectives and then the assessment. So the lesson is going to be about cooking. I think you're all in university, so you can think about it in terms of university students. So it can be a little more leveled up. Let me share. Okay. So here's our lesson plan. Our objectives are here. Use the imperative tense. Explain how to make a dish in English using time words such as first, second, next, then. And use appropriate cooking terms like boiling, frying, baking, whatever. So here, I want you to try to write some differentiated objectives. What do you want your students of different levels to be able to do? So this is what we did last week. If you can just pretend a little bit that students watched a cooking video and practice imperative tense and learn some vocabulary. So this week we have 45 minutes to complete an assessment. So you can choose an assessment for your students. It can pretty much be anything. You can have them make a video, do a worksheet, read something. It's really up to you. As for different levels for your students, you can pick to have 2 levels, 3 levels, 4 levels, whatever you want. And I have had these divided into groups, but as there's so few of us, I think we can just do it in the main room and you can ignore where it says group. So how about Nicholas, you can click group 1, Heidi, you can click group 2, James, you can be group 3, and Annapurna, if you're there, you can be group 4. And you can edit the doc directly and let me know if you can't.
How many different levels did you say, sorry?
You can pick whatever's appropriate for your classroom. If we're seeing this as an exercise that might be beneficial to you. So I would say at least 2, or else it's not differentiation. And on this.
Can I recruit Kirsten to be on my team?
Okay. So Kirsten, we're doing a workshop now to differentiate an assignment to be some different levels. So I think I have one more. So let me send you a doc and you can work on it if you so like.
I'm on my phone because my laptop died today, so it might
Oh no.
be difficult. Yeah,
Well, you can look at it and you can
I'd love
think
to
about
let
it.
them. Sorry for crashing the party so late.
Oh no, we're glad you showed up. Okay, I
Okay,
just DM'd you.
Autumn, the time words.
So just think first, second, then next.
Okay, not necessarily timed as in 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 7 minutes.
You can also add those if you like, but would you like a few more minutes to work, or is it okay?
I think I'm all right, but I'm not sure I've done it right. But yeah.
There's really no right or wrong answer to this. It's whatever would be maybe appropriate for your students or situation or classroom. So
Yeah, I'm looking at what I wrote and wondering, did I just write activities instead of objectives?
So would you like to share what you wrote?
Okay, I could do that. Maybe I can share my screen.
Mhm.
I just did 2 levels. So for my low level, I've got matching cooking words to pictures. So I imagine illustrations of the different things, and then putting illustrated cooking steps in order. And I imagine kind of sentences that have the time words at the beginning already. And so they would just put those in order. For the higher level students, I'd have them look at pictures and see if they could come up with the cooking words to describe it. But that's not an objective, that's an activity, isn't it? Well, the target is still the same. They have to know the cooking words. They have to be able to associate the form with the meaning.
Yeah.
And
So if you
yeah, I guess explaining the difference between cooking words, that's more of an objective. Match collocations for the cooking words, like, you know, fry eggs, grate cheese and stuff. And then write a recipe including the time words, if, you know, they're given some scattered vocabulary, I guess.
Yeah. So I think you have some good objectives. If you wanted to change a bit of your wording to make them more objective-y and less activity, you could be able to identify cooking words using pictures instead of just saying matching.
That's good advice.
Or be able to produce vocabulary when getting a picture prompt. But I think that's the only real difference is how we word things.
Word. And you know, I do teacher training too. And I always scold my students if they've written activities instead of objectives. So that's a useful tip.
Right. Would anybody else like to share what they did or get some feedback on what they did or came up with?
Sure.
All right, James.
So am I sharing?
You can share.
So I just took the objectives and rephrased as far as imperative tense and not short phrases and keywords to explain the video, what the dish is and plan. So they're kind of a cooking show critic or whatever, and maybe they show the video, but explain how to make the dish in English, and I just added the time words there. But then no one I didn't make any adjustments on that one. I kind of spent more time focusing on that. And then I got more into the assessments. So making a 1-minute video using 10-second steps with 5 to 6 steps, 10 seconds for each of the, explain the video, use the time words, and then for the advanced ones, making an extended comic, like a storyboard, and then they would make a 2 to 5 minute video kind of following the storyboard where they could either animate it or narrate it. So then they're explaining those steps with the terms.
I think that's really great. I really like how you divided low-level students into just 10-second chunks. Because if you tell low-level students a minute, they'll probably think, oh, I can't talk for a minute in English. But 10 seconds, they can probably definitely talk for at least 10 seconds. So
thanks.
Super great. All right. Kirsten, did you want to share anything?
Yeah. So I started looking at the objectives, and I teach elementary students. I thought for the lower level, they would be able to use a template maybe to write instructions, but a higher level students, they might have a simpler template with more space to fill, or maybe even a blank template for writing a recipe. So I was just thinking about I had a writing activity in mind, and how to differentiate that between like a lower level learners and higher level learners in the same class. They could do the activity at the same time. And I really like James's idea for the assessment, making a video. I think that would be great if they could do something like that, not with real food, but maybe with pictures or something. But yeah, that was how far I got.
Oh, that's pretty good. We talked about the scaffold some earlier before you were here, and you pretty much said everything we talked about. Low-level students, just give them more scaffold, and high-level students, take it away. They don't need it.
I'd also thought about just having them make a bowl of ramen and then explain the steps.
Oh, yeah. Even low-level students sometimes get really motivated if we give them activity with content that they know about. So even a really low-level student who doesn't know English, they know how to make ramen, so they'll probably try. And that's another reason I like using content, because content motivation can make up for language motivation in a lot of ways. So low-level students, they can go get the ramen, they can show you, they can stir a pot, even if they can't tell you they're stirring a pot. Oh, and Heidi says food is motivating. Yeah,
motivating.
Always. Right. Nicholas, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I can share my. So I just did it in 2 levels as well. So I just changed the difficulty of the task, I guess. Like I want them to do this. I want them to achieve the same thing at the end, right? You know, I don't want one group to like do less than the other group.
Yeah.
You know, I want them to sort of actually both at the end make a recipe, like write a recipe. You know? So it's just a case of making one more. I mean, just simpler, right? So the low level just does, instead of a full recipe, you know, they just do 4 to 5 steps of a process. They only have to use 3 of the most basic time words, and they only have to use 2 of the most basic sort of 2 or 3, you know, most basic cooking terms, and then they can present it in a slightly different way, which is a bit like what James said about the comic strip thing, like, you know, the series of kind of like pictures, I guess, you know, so you could give them on the assessment worksheet, whatever, you could give them like 4 boxes and they could actually sort of sketch out the process. I kind of find that like low level learners can be more motivated by like doing things like that, like artistic things, drawing and that kind of stuff. And it can also help them get their ideas across. They don't have the language. It gives them a way to express what they're trying to say. And then higher levels, it's the same like outcome, but just to make it more complex. So they've got to do it in eight steps or whatever number it is. They've got to use more time words, more of the cooking terms. They might do one picture to kind of illustrate what their recipe is, and then they just have to kind of list. So it's more a writing task. So it's like differentiated in that way. But the objective is the same, really, to make a recipe, that can be followed.
Yeah, I think that looks great. It looks very appropriate. You're asking the same task, but just difficulty level is ramped up a little bit because we can expect more from our high level learners. So
yeah,
looks great. And we only have about 5 minutes, so let's sprint through some rubrics. So it's loading. So when it comes to rubrics, just in how it's appropriate or beneficial to choose an assignment or assessment that's appropriate, we should also try to choose an appropriate rubric. So this is a sample rubric that's again from WIDA. And you can imagine that it's from CEFR or whatever. So remember, our level 1 is the really low level students who don't really speak English. So from them, I want to see that they've tried. I want to see that they're organized, that, with pictures, with visuals, how they present. I also want to see appropriate vocabulary. So in this cooking example, I want them to know boil, fry, baked, words like that. Okay, let's skip to our mid-level. So for my mid-level students, I want them to use full sentences. If they're intermediate, they should be able to produce at least short sentences. Even if there's a few grammar issues, they should try. Again, they should have good organization with how they speak too, if they use some visuals or other things. And again, I want them to use appropriate vocabulary. And for my advanced level students, I want them to show me consistent command of the language. When they speak, I want to hear that they know what they're going to say in the future. I want that they're using more leveled out English. I don't want them to go back and forth between how they speak. I don't want a lot of pauses generally. With their organization, I want to hear linking words. I want to hear linking phrases in how they speak to show organization. First, then, next. And I want them to use varied vocabulary. So if we are making ramen, like James mentioned, I don't want to hear, get the water, make the water hot, put the ramen in the hot water, then take the hot water, pour it off. They should be able to say, bring the water up to a simmer, then to a boil, then keep it at a constant temperature. Afterwards, you need to lower the temperature. I'm expecting a lot more from them in that regard. So I would recommend highly, if it's possible, to give your students a rubric in Korean. They need to be able to read it and understand it to know what you're grading for and what they're aiming for. Because if it's kind of a mystery to them, if you were to give this to low-level students, they have no idea unless they Google Translate. So if possible, give them a rubric in their L1. All right, we only have about 2 minutes left. Do we have any final questions or thoughts?
I think that the last point you made about giving the students a rubric in a form that they can access it is really helpful. I had an experience a few months ago in a Korean class where I had an exam, but I didn't actually really understand what I had to do, even though the teacher kindly explained many times to us. And it turned out I wasn't the only one during the speaking exam who just did not produce the required language. And if we had had even a written one in Korean would have helped. But she told us verbally many times over Zoom, and it was fine. But I didn't know that I wasn't understanding, and my colleagues also didn't know that we weren't understanding. And it happens to our own students as well. We tell them something, and they're like, "Yep, I get it." But then when you go to the activity, you know, it's miscommunication or not knowing that you haven't really picked up on what needs to be done. So I really like that point. I would definitely try that with my students.
Yeah, and so again, and with that, kind of the language that we use in our rubric should be extremely clear. We don't need to have vague usage. They're able to use a few words kind of when you're writing or choosing rubrics. Make sure it's really spelled out for students, and that will make your life as an educator easier, because then you can avoid a lot of questions on Zoom asking, what exactly are we doing? What are you grading for? Okay, any final question? Okay, well, if you do, or if you want to contact me about anything else, you can email me. I'll put my email in the chat now. I'm autumn.giftle@gmail.com, and feel free to get in touch anytime.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much, Autumn.
Mm-hmm.
Nice job. And maybe have a little round of applause.
Thank you. That was really great.
It was interesting.
Thank
Thank you.
It's a great way to wind up the conference. And yeah,
Great. I'm glad that you all came.
I have some very actionable takeaways. I'm going to go translate my rubric now.
Yes.
Great. I'm always happy to hear it wasn't a waste of time.
Oh no, I'm really glad I came.
My only objective for myself. All right, everybody have a great Sunday night.
I do have a question. I try to ask this sometimes. What have you learned in this process, or what has been solidified as being something that's like, yeah, I'm really on top of this one?
For assessments and rubrics in general?
Yeah, just like something that either you came across as you were making sure about what you were presenting, or just what either really became confirmed or affirmed as you were putting together, or was a new insight on all of this.
When I presented this to Korean teachers, to secondary level Korean teachers, a lot of them like to argue about fairness, and they say that differentiation isn't fair. Because if you give something to a low-level student, that's easier than a high-level student. So that was a big thing, because in my mind, creating an equitable classroom can be more important. So trying to convince people to differentiate and its importance, and also hearing how a lot of different educators have been differentiating their classroom has been really beneficial to me, because it gives me ideas that I can later steal and use for myself.